Hello, interesting and interested people. I know you're interesting because the comments keep coming. The comments and the questions and the offerings of insight, please keep them coming. Please go to that comment section, wherever you can find it, and let me know what you're thinking, because I'm inspired. I'm inspired by that input. It's January 2025. I'm recording this in the immediate aftermath of a new president of the United States being handed the keys to the Oval Office. I don't think that place is ever locked. But anyway, Donald J. Trump has been sworn in as 47th president. And so that's the context from one of the most powerful men in the world. Today, in this episode of Hauntings, I would, if you'll let me, take you back to the time of another ruler, another man who wielded incredible power in his own right and is firmly imprinted in history. But before we get on to that, let me please remind you about how you can show support for this channel. Primarily that's by going to patreon.com, finding me, and, parting with a little bit of cash. The cost of a cup of coffee every month. And in return, you become a member of the family. You get early access to all the new content and exclusive access to, amongst other things, a question and answer session. Also the odd competition.
Neil, just quickly on that, we haven't done a competition for a while. Shall we get one organised?
Absolutely. I mean, there's my hauntings book, which is, I've got a few copies left in the house myself, but we can get more.
Get them signed.
And signed dedications for the winners. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We won't make it up on the spot, but you and I, backstage, we can sort something out. But yes, we will. Another competition incoming. But now, let's get back to our travels. Seeking something spooky. Cue the music. This week's haunting, it's in Windsor Castle, which must be one of the most famous castles in England, in the British Isles. That familiar big, pale, drum-shaped, round tower. And it's often the backdrop for recent royal weddings and so on and so forth, and it's a big tourist attraction. I don't know the extent to which people necessarily associate it strongly with Henry VIII, that most famous of English kings, certainly the most famous of the Tudor kings. I don't know how much people connect him to that particular tourist attraction, but he does have roots there. It's also a bit about Herne the Hunter, who's a mythological figure. But like all mythological figures, he possibly at least, has some connection to a real person who lived and died at some point in the past. In fact, in the case of Herne the Hunter, there's more than one possibility for him. I think last time we were in Iona, the island of Iona off the west coast of Scotland. Anyway, as time goes on, maybe you ask, I certainly ask myself, how this has come about, this consideration of haunting. And in part of my self-analysis, I wonder why I read what I read and why I write what I write. And I'm not sure. I think some of it comes from a subconscious place, but I interrogate my motivations all the time. Why did I write that? Sometimes I go to one of my own books, a history book, because I'm looking for a fact that I know is in it, or that I can find it there apart from anywhere else. And I'll get drawn into it, and I'll be reading pages and I'll think, I don't remember writing that. That feels like it was written by somebody else. It's really strange, but then I have published, I don't know, over 1 million words. So I suppose it's not really surprising that I've, some of it's just gone from the forefront of my mind. But when it comes to why I read what I write, I think a big part of the answer comes down to plain curiosity about people. People in the here and now, as well as those in the past. I think my interest in the past and my interest in history and archaeology ultimately is because I'm interested about people generally. And in recent years, I didn't always think like this. It's certainly not when I was at university, being schooled in archaeology. But in recent years, I have become increasingly preoccupied with wondering to what extent people, hundreds, far less, thousands of years ago, were like us at all. Their consciousness, the way they related to reality. I wonder, really, we're tricked largely into thinking people were always like us and just their circumstances were different, but I'm not sure. So I wonder to what extent we could meaningfully relate to them, if we could get back to them and talk to them, the people in the past. And if we could relate to them, to what extent? But, or would it be like an encounter with, another species? I really don't know. This episode is slanted towards royalty. Obviously, you'll have got that from the fact that it's in Windsor Castle and it sort of hangs around the broad shoulders of Henry VIII. And I'm often of the opinion, when I say I'm interested in people, I look on at what people do. I'm watching what people are doing now. Obviously this is for historical purposes. This is in the immediate aftermath of Donald Trump's inauguration as 47th President of the United States. Very controversial sequence of events leading to that. And I'm fascinated by how people are responding to it. It's amazing people watching. People who are happy, people who are sad, people who are indifferent. And broadly, I'm of the opinion that people behave as they do. And we look on at people who are behaving differently from us, it is down to their circumstances, and it is down to the things that have happened to them. But as I like to do, I look on at presidents. There's a lot of presidents around. It's not just Trump. Biden's floating about there, and at the recent funeral of President Jimmy Carter. For those of you old enough to remember him, Jimmy Carter, peanut farmer. And at that funeral, they were all there. Obama, the Bushes, the Clintons, and they're royalty by any other name. There's dynasties forming around them. And I look on at the way they behave, and clearly they behave differently. And they're able to because societal norms are not evenly applied. What the rich and powerful can get away with is very different from what you and I can. But, and here I'll get into the meat of it, but my last thought would be, I find that I have to be wary about judging royalty, judging presidents, judging billionaires. I know I have to be wary unless I'm prepared to judge myself. Judge not lest ye be judged, and all of that. And it was, it was with the same sort of thought in mind that I kicked the chapter off in the book with a quote from John Donne and the popular poem "For Whom the Bell Tolls." "Therefore send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Be aware at all times that a clock's ticking and time is counting down, and everything that happens to everybody else affects us at an elemental level. So when I came to thinking about Windsor Castle and Henry VIII, I thought about, and I had stumbled across this previously, and I went back to it and looked up the details. On the 9th of September 2022, which was the day after Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II died, and she exhaled her last breath at Balmoral. But on that day, the day after she died, a bell in that round tower of Windsor Castle tolled 96 times, which was one ding for each of the 96 years of her life. And, you're looking on at it, and I don't know, depending on the commentary that was provided, if there was any, and I couldn't honestly testify to say whether there was or not, but we as onlookers, we just accept the pomp and the ceremony and the ritual without necessarily knowing why it's happening. But the bell that rang was the Sebastopol bell, and it was one of two bells that were captured from the Church of the 12 Apostles in Crimea in 1856 during the Crimean War. And that bell is only rung when a senior royal dies, and it only rings to count their years. That's what it does. And on that day in 2022, it was the first time it had sounded for 20 years, because the last time it had been called into its very particular service was when the Queen Mum died. And it means, really, when you get right down to it, the Sebastopol bell is grim. If it's ever rung, if you ever hear it ringing, if you're ever told it's the Sebastopol bell, it's only bad news. It just responds to death. Where did it come from? I said Crimea. At the Crimean War, I'm sure you know, that's when Russia, big old, mighty old Russia at the time, was at war with Britain, France, Piedmont, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. And the city of Sebastopol was besieged in 1854 by us and the French working together. And the city held everything at bay for about a year. But then it fell. Sieges don't always go with the besiegers. They quite often, the siege breaks away for want of, momentum. But in this event, the city fell. And it actually, for fans of coincidences, it fell on the same day, on the same date as Queen Elizabeth II's death. So the city fell on the 9th of September 1855. It was broken by then. It was smashed to bits. And the bell, 2 bells were taken out of that church as loot, as trophies. One was installed at Windsor Castle with a big cannon, a great big Russian cannon as well. But and the other of the 2 went to Aldershot Barracks in Hampshire, North Hampshire, home, the principal home of the British Army. It's been there ever since. It doesn't do anything much. But as I say, to reiterate, the Sebastopol bell means death and only death. And it's part of the fabric now of Windsor Castle. The castle, though, is ancient. Its present iteration in stone is just part of its story. In fact, Windsor Castle, or a royal presence on that site, goes all the way back to the 11th century and William the Conqueror, the aftermath of Hastings. William was a tactician. He was a soldier. He was tactically minded, and he, with a view to defending the western approaches to London, any enemy coming from the west, he chose a site overlooking the River Thames for a strong point, and it had a good, relatively high up. He didn't break ground there necessarily, really. Or when I say that, he hadn't. He wasn't the first royal to notice the appeal of the place. It was already and had been a hunting ground for Saxons, which was the lineage that he displaced, by conquering. And in 1070, he set people to work building a timber fortress. He wasn't really planning for accommodation. It was a place where soldiers could be installed to keep an eye. But then, the timber building was there for a period of time, and then about 100 years later, the round tower was built. But it was still with defence in mind. There's something quite cosy, I think, about Windsor Castle. Sometimes I play that game of thinking, where would I live if I was suddenly made king? What royal residence would I pick? And I quite like the look of Windsor Castle. It looks quite homely. I've been around it a few times as a tourist. I could imagine living there. And it's been, it's been touched up again and again. Edward III modified it. He's 14th century. He spent the better part of £50,000. Money at that time, £50,000 at the time, to modify it, and making it by far the biggest sum of money that any medieval king in this country spent on a single building. And he built official parts of it, and also private apartments for himself and his queen, Philippa of Hainault. Elizabeth I is the next name strongly associated with it, and by the time she came, it was falling apart a bit. And she fixed it up. Then the Stuarts came. The Stuarts arrived with James VI of Scotland, first of England. They too put their own churches to it. King George III, King George IV, they had to go at the place. George IV actually did so much to it that it meant that his successors didn't really have to touch it for a protracted period of time. Queen Victoria came in. She added a private chapel. She didn't need to do much to make it wind and watertight, so to speak, but she added a chapel. And various modifications, a big fancy staircase and so on. Now, to bring it up to date, really, for people of, certainly my vintage, there was a fire. It's all over the news. That chapel, actually, in the roof, it caught fire on the 20th of November 1992, and the fire gutted the chapel and then took out St George's Hall, took out the grand reception room, the state dining room, the Crimson drawing room, and so on and so on. Major damage. I remember the footage of it, smoke and flames billowing out. It was surreal. So this incredibly familiar landmark, and it was, it looked as if it was going to burn to the ground, and it, massive damage was done before they got a grip of it. And I remember watching the late Queen giving a speech subsequently, and she called the burning of the castle part of her annus horribilis, her dreadful year. And certainly it was. 1992 was a cracker for Queen Elizabeth. All sorts of stuff. Family scandal all over the place. Andrew separated from Sarah, Prince Andrew, Sarah Ferguson. So their marriage foundered. Then in April of the same year, Princess Anne divorced Captain Mark Phillips. And in the summer of the same year, there was a book, an unauthorised biography of Diana, Princess of Wales, and she went public with how unhappy she was in that marriage. And then in November, to crown it, Windsor Castle caught fire. So it was a grim old year for Liz. So for 1,000 years, from William the Conqueror right through, Windsor Castle has been there. It's one of the oldest buildings in England. And it's seen them come and it's seen them go, happy and sad. And the Grim Reaper, Death, has prowled the halls and staircases and the grounds of Windsor Castle like a hunter. He's been, death respects nobody. And according to those that know it, who know Windsor Castle, there are many who would claim that there are people, royal and common, both, that having been in the castle, have stayed in the castle after death. Their wraiths, their spirits, their presence, whatever, lingers long after they're gone. And it goes without saying, almost, given the intro, that Henry VIII had a big impact on Windsor Castle. He did structural things to the place. He added the Grand Gate, that is Henry's Gate. He added a terrace, so that you could watch the hunting, because it had been a Saxon hunting ground, and it was still the open woodland below the castle was still somewhere that he would stand and sit up there and watch the hunt going on. Henry, where do you begin? I mean, they're almost caricatures, these people, by which I mean that the legend of them is much bigger than the people. It's very hard to imagine what they were actually like in person. What they looked like, what their voices were like, what they smelt like. You know what I mean? It's very hard to establish any kind of human connection with them, because they're like cartoon characters. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon. It's almost like a nursery rhyme or a poem you learn at school. Everyone knows about Henry VIII. Well, everyone in Britain. Catherine was the widow of his elder brother Henry. Henry was supposed to be king, but he died young and left a widow. And when Henry VIII succeeded him, he took on the wife as well. And it looks like it was a love match to begin with. Maybe he had a thing for older women. But anyway, it looks as if he was happy enough about the match at the time. But they're tragic. They are a tragic couple. Well, that's one way to describe them. It's the role of kings to sire heirs. That's job number one. Anything else they do is secondary to continuing the line. So you've got to have a son. You've got to make a baby boy, one way or another. And he got to work at that with Catherine. And it's tragic. I mean, she gave birth to their first stillborn daughter in 1510. And then in 1511, just a year, I mean, think of the toll that this begins to take on a woman. 1511, there's a boy, the longed-for boy, called Henry. He lives for 2 months and then he dies. Don't know why. This didn't thrive. Then they had two more, one after the other, two more baby boys, both stillborn, in 1513 and 1515. And then finally they have a daughter who lives, and that's Mary. Unlucky, unhappy Mary. She was born in 1516. And as I say, Henry and Catherine of Aragon, they're almost rendered into two dimensions by their legend. But you have to remember them as people, and to remember what impact it must have had on them as a couple to have and lose so many babies, either stillbirth or soon thereafter. You know, that is a leveler. Whether you're a king or an emperor, or you know, or the lowliest private person, that takes a toll that I think is so foundational to any contemplation of what those two people were like and what else they did in their lives. How do you measure the impact of all that loss? You know, you read about it and it's like when you go into Victorian graveyards and you look at the gravestones, and it'll be a family plot, and there'll be this terrible litany of children dying young. And you look on at that and think, oh yeah, that's the Victorians for you, or whatever. But it's to overlook what that must have been like for these people that carried on. They had to go on in the face of all that loss. So there's that. Whatever Henry became, whatever Catherine became, that's huge. And, well, I mean, Henry always had mistresses. He was a good-looking fella, apparently. Big, athletic. He was good at physical things, you know, the jousting and wrestling and all of that kind of thing. A fine figure of a fella. And he was the king, so he had his pick. And he had unknown numbers of women. If you go to the observatory at Greenwich now, you know, where you can step on either side of that line that separates one time from another, and so on and so on. Well, long before there was the observatory there was a hunting lodge up there, and it was a cosy place that Henry liked to have his assignations with his women. So that's there too. He was spectacularly unfaithful to whoever he was married to. 1518, there was another stillborn daughter for Catherine and Henry, and then the following year, because he's having it away with other women all the time, he had an illegitimate son who's, you know, Henry Fitzpatrick is his name, and he was sired with Bessie Blunt, good name, and she was the daughter of one of Henry's servants, Sir John Blunt. He certainly had an affair with Mary Boleyn, who was one of Catherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting, and he may well have fathered her two sons, you know. So all of this is going on at the same time. In 1525, infamously falls for Mary's sister, Anne Boleyn. So he got 2 for 2 there. But Anne was a political player, probably coached by family, but she wouldn't let him have his way. She insisted on marriage. Now, he's married to Catherine of Aragon, and so he's you know, Henry's hook, line, and sinker. You know, when he falls hard, and he decides to move heaven and earth to get a divorce from Catherine, and so that he can marry Anne. And this becomes what is known to history as the king's great matter, doing everything he can to try and dissolve the marriage, get rid of the marriage with Catherine, so that he's free to do whatever he wants with his latest flame. But, well, long story short, he divorces the Church of Rome instead. He breaks away from the Catholic Church, sets up the Church of England, calls himself head of it, so that he can do whatever he wants. Catherine of Aragon is pushed to one side, but that's the most he can do. She's out of sight, but she's not out of mind. He marries Anne Boleyn, and from that point on, Henry is often running on that great journey of his reputation, which is marrying and getting rid of women. It's the 6 wives of Henry VIII. By the end, he'll have divorced 2, being Catherine of Aragon and then later on Anne of Cleves. Jane Seymour, who's another one that he was absolutely head over heels about, she bore him the desperately needed, desperately wanted son, Edward. But she died soon after, breaking his heart, temporarily. Catherine Parr, she was his last wife, and she outlived him. But she's a hell of a trick. She managed to duck and dive until the old monster was in the ground. And the other 2, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, they well, famously, they ended up on the butcher's block. He took their heads off. Not himself, obviously, but they were both beheaded. He's an enigma, Henry. I mean, he's monstrous, without a doubt. I mean, his behaviour's appalling, broadly speaking, but he's an enigma nonetheless. David Starkey, who's a legend in his own right, British historian David Starkey, and he's made a lifetime study of Tudors and royalty and monarchy and so on and so on. And he looks at Henry and well, he describes Henry's behaviour towards women as eccentric, not half, and that's even in the context of the standards of the time, which is to say, a time in history when infidelity was expected of virile kings. They were supposed to be out there, in out, shaking it all about in pursuit of carrying on the line. But at the same time, the hypocrisy of it, infidelity by their wives, their queens, that was punishable by death. But even in that context, Henry stands out, with his 6 wives and so much horror and bloodshed. David Starkey said, that Henry was he was at times a good husband. He had it in him, and he definitely liked women, because he kept marrying them. And he could be very tender. He could be every inch the romantic lover, soft-hearted. He was very generous. He was incredibly considerate to those who were pregnant when they were pregnant. Very attentive. But as Starkey puts it, as he describes, when Henry fell out of love with a wife for any reason, he just cut them off. He cauterised the wound. He felt nothing, it would appear. He withdrew from them. He abandoned them. Sometimes they didn't even. Sometimes often the women were the last to know. He just moved on. His affections just evaporated, and they woke up one morning and realised that he was a million miles away from them. So we've spoken in this channel about the residue of emotion that lingers in a place, like smoke from a fire, perfume on a wearer who has left the room. Then, if there's anything in that, and I think there is, then it would explain why at Windsor Castle, which is haunted, if you believe in haunting, it's Henry's shade, his wraith, his ghost, wretched, rotten, Henry's miserable ghost that's commonly cited, or people see things or experience something or hear a howl or hear someone dragging their leg along a corridor in agony, and they put it down to the spirit of Henry VIII. And who am I to say they're not telling the truth, expressing the reality of whatever it was they experienced? Where to pick up with him, really? He and Jane Seymour, mother of Edward, mother of the surviving male heir, and for that reason, she most satisfactorily fulfilled the role of queen for Henry. It's he and she who are buried in the vault beneath St George's Chapel. It's so weird. I don't think it's generally known, but in that space beneath St George's Chapel, there's not just Henry and Jane Seymour, mother of King Edward. There's also the remains of Charles I and a baby. 4 of them, 4 human beings in that space, borrowed from the clay, you might say. And the baby, believe it or believe it not, is one of the 17 doomed children born to Queen Anne. Tragic Queen Anne. 17 children, and not an effectively surviving heir among them. And if you go and see it, there's a plain dark marble slab, and it has the identities of the mismatched royals, for they are all royal, that are in that space. But here's the fascinating thing about it. It was only supposed to be temporary for Henry and Jane Seymour. When she died, he was broken by it, and he had plans for a grand mausoleum for her and for him. His plan at the time was that they would lie together. I mean, Jane had played the same game, if game it was, as Anne Boleyn, in that she had held Henry at arm's length until he married her. Pause for a moment to contemplate, what happened to Anne Boleyn. I mean, she was just a young woman, and she was beheaded because she ended up in the way. She ended up in the way of Jane Seymour. So when Henry's affections had moved to Jane Seymour, Anne Boleyn went from being the love of his life to just being an obstacle, and he killed her, or he had her killed. Well, she's beheaded, and you might think like that vision that comes to people's minds, the butcher's block, the chopping block, and the axeman swinging. Well, that's not what happened to Anne. She opted for kneeling upright, head up, and a French swordsman had been specially brought in from France to do the job, and he swung horizontally, partner from her head, and the body. It's grisly and horrific beyond words. And it's only 11 days. She's parted from her head, and 11 days later, Henry marries Jane. What's going on in a mind like that? His and Jane Seymour. This is the backdrop to their nuptials. Is the beheading of a young woman who'd really done nothing wrong. She'd done nothing wrong. That happened in the Tower of London. And Catherine Howard, he cut Catherine Howard's head off as well, but although she was dispatched with the axe. I mean, while we're on the subject, both Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn are amongst 15 individuals from the great and the good who are in a hole with the dimensions of just 6 yards by 4 beneath the floor of the Royal Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. That's St. Peter in chains, inside the Tower of London. So, the Tower of London was where, enemies of the state or whatever were taken and tortured and incarcerated and, often dispatched. And 15 of them, rather than take them outside the tower, they never come out again. They're in this little mass grave underneath the flagstone floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Imagine! And Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard are in there with 13 others. So death is hanging around Henry, old Hal, like a bad smell. Jane Seymour died just 17 months later. Just 17 months. It's all happening so fast. But anyway, so I digressed. A tomb commissioned by Henry was under construction. And it was Henry's intention that he and Jane would spend eternity together in the in the tomb, but it never happens. So much for royal commands. After he's gone, it doesn't happen. So I mean, in the meantime, Jane was put temporarily into the vault, just out of sight. Henry died in 1547, and he had it in his will that his children were to finish the mausoleum and move him and Jane into it. But it just never happened. One way or another, they just got left. Put away with the Christmas decorations and the rest of the stuff that folk hadn't bothered to clear away. And so there they were, and there they are. And not only that, but they were, they weren't left in peace. Even there, they were joined by others. 102 years later, when Oliver Cromwell's Parliament were in a bit of trouble. I mean, having decapitated Charles I, there was a mob out there that were less than impressed with regicide, and in an attempt to appease that, Cromwell's Parliament had saw to it and publicly proclaimed that Charles I would be laid beside Henry. Bit of the idea being that rather than being, I don't know, put out with the bins, he would be put in the presence of another fellow monarch. So now there's 3 beneath the floor. One of them separated from their head. And so, I mean, everything moves on then. They're forgotten until 1813. And during the building of a mausoleum in the chapel. By this time, it's George III that's on the throne. That space, that vault, is disturbed, and what the people find, whether it's properly forgotten or just sort of, out of sight, out of mind, they find Henry and they find Jane, and beside them there's Charles I minus his skull. Well, his skull's there, but separated from the body, and also the tiny bones of an infant. And this, as I say, was one of Queen Anne's multiple stillbirths. Why that one ended up in the circumstances in which it ended up is not quite clear. Anyone looking down into that space and seeing the decapitated skeleton might have thought it was Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard. But no, it was Charles. And there you go. The four of them are finally are just left down there in relative ignominy until William IV, who comes in the line before Victoria, commissioned a lid for them, which is the dark marble lid that has their identities upon it. I mean, this is how these people are. This is how these people are. This is what happens to these people. It is extraordinary. We're talking here about Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, King Charles I, not to mention the stillborn of Queen Anne, and they just end up under the floor. It's extraordinary to me, the way these people carry on and the way the people around them carry on. And so much death. So much death. But then you might expect it of a castle like Windsor, which is there for 1,000 years, with so much drama going on, so much sadness. And as I say, Henry's often reported wandering the place, wandering the hallways, wandering the cloisters, and people claim to hear his distinctive footsteps, which is someone dragging a bad leg. Now, for those not acquainted with the physical reality of him, by the time he died, he was a bloated, rotting carcass. He had been athletic, but he'd been injured in the jousting. He'd taken a leg wound, and then it was aggravated by further injury. It never healed properly. And for the rest of his life, it was this ulcerated mess. Actually, it's not inconsequential. It's been suggested that the pain of it and his incapacity and maybe the weight gain that came with his incapacity and all of the rest of it changed him, changed his personality from what he had been, which was, to some extent, and when it suited him, a tender lover, into a monster. Some of that behaviour might have been contributed to and a consequence of his injury. And certainly people say that sometimes they hear screaming and moaning and a spirit tormented by pain emotional and pain physical. And so they deduce that it's Henry. But he really was a monster. When Anne Boleyn had fallen from favour, she didn't go down alone. Well, it was no wish of hers, but 5 men went with her, including her own brother George Boleyn. As the theatre built up to the justification of getting rid of Anne, all these characters got pulled into the vortex. All of them were accused of having had adulterous affairs with Anne, and obviously in the case of George, that was an incestuous adulterous affair. And all 5 of them were dispatched 2 days before Anne. It was carnage, which was a pattern that was repeated by Henry. Catherine Howard's dispatch was foreshadowed by the execution of her courtier, Thomas Culpeper, and her former fiancé, Francis Derham. And again, the allegation was that they had been sleeping with her while she was married to Henry. And so if it is Henry's spirit that's roaming Windsor, then his guilt, let's imagine in death, he's got a guilty conscience. And goodness me, there's enough reasons for Henry's ghost to be guilty. And there's enough reasons for all of that misery and all of that horror to have outlived him as a residue and to hang around the hallways of Windsor. But he's a long way from being the only ghost reported there. Obviously, Anne Boleyn's is sighted. She roams the grounds, and she's seen the broken-hearted woman looking out of the window of the Dean's cloister. From time to time, get this, people have reported seeing a carriage pulled by headless horses, guided by a headless driver. And it's not just one, it's been seen multiple times. The people say that they know it's Anne Boleyn because the passenger inside the carriage is holding her own severed head. I'd be up for a sighting like that. I'm desperate to see a ghost, and if you're going to see a ghost, that's a cracker. But Windsor, I mentioned at the top of this, Windsor or the surrounding Great Park. Windsor has a great park around it, the hunting grounds, so on and so on, haunted by Herne the Hunter. And he is a figure from myth. And there's more than one version of a backstory for him. One puts him at the time of King Richard II, that he was a gamekeeper, a kind of a, in charge of the hunt for Richard II, and that Richard II liked this individual because he was a particularly good hunter. And in the way of things, the other people in the entourage were jealous of the favour that was shown to this one keeper, and they framed him so that he was cast out, exiled by Richard. And he was so broken by suddenly going from flavour of the month to exile that he hanged himself from an oak tree. And the tree in question is near Frogmore House, which is also famous in the grounds of Windsor Castle. And in the vicinity of that tree, many people say they have seen Herne in the form of a cloaked figure with horns, stag's horns, Herne the Hunter, a kind of halfway between a human and a stag. Queen Victoria even went so far as to have the tree felled and the timber burnt to kind of exorcise the presence. But Herne the Hunter isn't going anywhere. And this is probably why Victoria sought to erase the idea of Herne the Hunter. His appearance is a portent of doom. It means incoming bad luck for the royal family. So, justifiably, the royal family don't want Herne the Hunter hanging around. There's even reference to him in Shakespeare's Merry Wives of Windsor. There is an old tale goes that Herne the Hunter, sometime a keeper here in Windsor Forest, doth all the winter time at still midnight walk around about an oak with great ragged horns, and there he blasts the tree and takes the cattle and makes much kine yield blood and shakes a chain in a most hideous and dreadful manner. You have heard of such a spirit, and well you know the superstitious idle-headed eld received and did deliver to our cage this tale of Herne the Hunter for a truth. Interestingly, given let's say that Henry's life was serial unhappiness, at least as far as his role as a husband, another version of the backstory for Herne the Hunter makes Henry responsible for Herne the Hunter, in that one Richard Horne, who was a yeoman in the time of Henry VIII, who was executed for poaching in the forest, because you weren't the royal park was strictly for kings and aristos, and if any lowly types went in and took any meat there, if they were caught doing it, they'd be done to death. So think about that. And then the image of the horned man, this horned figure, is a traditional representation of the cuckold, the cuck, which is to say a man whose wife is, taken by another. To be a cuckold is a humiliating position for a husband to be in. And in times past, people who knew would stand behind a cuckold and hold two fingers up, hold them up behind his head. You see people doing that to this day when they're ridiculing or taking the mickey out of someone for whatever reason. They hold it. Well, in times gone by, the horns were symbols of genitals, which is to say, not his, but whoever it was that had replaced him in the marriage bed. And the cuckold is always the last to know about the betrayal, and so on and so on. And so, long story short, the horned figure roaming the grounds of Windsor Castle, according to some, is another manifestation of Henry himself, his accompanying hurt and his paranoid bitterness, because he's always associated, he certainly claimed that his queens were being unfaithful to him, whether they were or not. He certainly made that claim. And so there's this idea that he himself, his unhappiness manifests in the form of this cuckolded figure that roams Windsor Great Park. So there's this long list of ghosts away from the royals. The deanery, which is another part of the accommodations, that's haunted by what's a voice, mostly a youngster who says simply, "I don't want to go hunting today." And various members of the royal family have heard this complaint, somewhere in their vicinity. "I don't want to go hunting today." And this is supposed to be the voice of a ghost. The bells in the curfew tower, they ring by themselves, when there's no one there. The ringing of the bells is associated with ghostly footsteps on the stairs up. There's a ghost of a soldier of the English Civil War who is apparently a prisoner held in the basement of the tower, the curfew tower, which, the basement of the tower is a dungeon. It's sometimes, which must be even more frightening, I would say, than a vision, that people feel him brushing past them. So there's just, they'll be walking and some unknown figure walks past. There's the ghost of a suicide, a guardsman who shot himself while on duty, and he roams the long walk. Whenever he's seen, anyone that reports seeing that one, he's smiling. A smiling ghost, which is even more horrifying than the thought of a grim-faced ghost, I would suggest. What's he smiling about? George III, the madness of King George. He was confined in his madness to his bedroom in Windsor Castle for long periods, and people say they see his likeness peering out of a window. They often see him when they're looking at the guards outside. They look up at a window and George III appears to be looking down, inspecting them. Elizabeth I, the other most famous of the Tudor royals, she's there. She roams the castle. Members of the royal family again, now whether they're just playing along with it to attract the tourists, I don't know, but various members of the royal family and others have reported seeing Good Queen Bess dressed all in black and walking through the royal library, and they hear her heels tap, tap, tapping on the floor as she makes her way through to, a little antechamber off the library. At least one of the bedrooms in the private apartments, which is, the place given over to the royals themselves, is haunted by the ghost of George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham, who was a favourite of James VI and First. He was a very pretty young man, and the rumours abounded about James VI and First, about where his predilections actually lay, and George Villiers was one of several, but easily the young man to whom James seemed most attracted, most fond for whatever reason. They were certainly rumoured to be lovers. He was a favourite, and undenied. I mean, James was frank about it, even spoke to the Privy Council and said, "You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled. I wish to speak in my own behalf and not to have it thought to be a defect." So he was right up front about the fact that he adored this individual, although he was denying a sexual relationship with him. It's quite strange, in this most devout of kings. He was christened Catholic but raised a Protestant. He it was that commissioned the translation of the Bible that bears his name, the King James Version, the authorised version of the Bible. And he actually invoked Jesus in his justification for his deep affection for Villiers. He said, "For Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had John, and I have George." And being adored by a monarch, is a double-edged sword, because it makes everyone else jealous, and it makes people conspire to get you out of the way. So it's a bit like a throwback to that's one of the backstories for Herne the Hunter, that he was turned on and got rid of by fellow hunters. Well, in the same vein, everyone in Villiers' company got sick to death of the favouritism. That said, he did survive the death of James, and he even became a favourite of James's son and successor, Charles I. Now, no one thought that Charles I was having a sexual relationship with George Villiers, but he still was a favourite, and he got one promotion after another, and he was largely incompetent, so why he was so favoured was never quite clear. He was Charles's Lord Admiral, he was de facto Foreign Secretary, and everything he turned his hand to ended in disaster, such that after a string of disasters overseas, Villiers was stabbed to death in the Greyhound pub in Portsmouth, as it happened, by an army officer called John Felton, who, amongst others, had lost all patience with the favours and the promotions showered upon George Villiers. King Charles is obviously amongst the ghostly characters that turn up. Various of the royals, the succeeding royals, have seen King Charles. Always sad, always forlorn. I'm not surprised he got his head cut off. Windsor Castle, that tourist attraction, that backdrop for happy royal occasions. It's a monument to many things. Maybe more than anything else, it's a monument to the longevity of monarchy in these islands, even allowing for the interregnum of the Commonwealth under Cromwell. And I may say, that interregnum, that interruption. But such was Britain's appetite for monarchy that the monarchy came back. And Windsor Castle prevails. It has been counting down the years for 1,000 years and more. And I started off by saying that, I'm driven and inspired by a fascination, a curiosity about the way people are. And there's no denying that the royals, past and present, are fascinating to watch. Whether you're fond of them or not as individuals, whether you approve of the existence of a monarchy or not, these people are very interesting because they give us some kind of insight into human nature. And Windsor Castle is also a reminder that kings and queens die like all the rest. And in the case of somebody like Henry, once they're gone, they're just put away out of sight. For all that they once mattered, for all the fear that their presence inspired, or the respect and admiration that they inspired, when they're gone, they're gone. Some of their deaths are as ignominious as any other death. They're as forgotten. So, as I say, that's why I think about it in relation to the poetry of John Donne. Timor mortis conturbat me. Fear of death gives me the willies. is another line, though not John Donne's, but John Donne said it. Therefore send not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee.